Faubert sought information for a living. That is to say that ever since he returned from Korea, after having served with the armed forces, he had been working as a private investigator in Montreal. William Hamilton, a rich industrialist, had gotten in touch with him regarding a simple vandalism issue. Nothing to write home about. Not worth hiring a private eye either, just so he can drive for hours on rough roads. But that's how it had always been. The client pays, Carl gets it done. They had set up to meet at the general store, his client's business. Well, actually, the entire village had William Hamilton's name written all over it. When the roads were bad, muddy, or snowed in, it was customary around these parts to close them off. But it was also customary to ignore those signs entirely and drive there anyway. Emperor Duplessis, in spite of his conservative agenda, did a good job in colonizing the rural north, which helped to re-establish the region as an integral part of the province of Quebec. The blue fleur-de-lis could be seen fluttering in the wind here and there, taunting the red Canadian flags on the other side of the province's boundaries. Still not a soul in sight. There was no point in waiting any longer. Carl had to figure this one out by himself. Hamilton is waiting for Carl in the general store. It was time for him to get down to business. Hamilton never mentioned a road-blocking barrier. Why was it needed here in the back of Beyond? That would, however, be a mystery for another day. Carl had waited long enough for someone to come and raise him. William Hamilton enjoyed a lavish country house built in the very heart of the northern forests, not too far from here. The local populace was divided when it came to the affluent man. Some saw a wealthy philanthropist dedicated to improving the region's economy. Others an aging Englishman who would do anything to further his fortunes. And those ones hated him enough to go on about scheming against him. Hamilton had recently acquired a few local businesses, but the last straw was the reopening of a mine, which gave rise to a wave of protests and threats from the Cree people. Given these circumstances, Carl reckoned that a good number of people must be feeling compelled to oppose Hamilton in one way or another. So far, only the industrialist's house had been a target, but soon enough, the target would become the man himself. Carl needed to get out of there. The cold and the pain required urgent care. never had taken off. It was still best to check it out and leave nothing to chance. Carl needed help. It was a small, locked box engraved with the letters W.H. Carl thought about taking it. Nothing was to be left to chance. Such heart-wrenching Nordic poetry that was. But Carl didn't care much about flowery language. It was so cold. Already Carl did not feel his toes anymore. This deep in the country, his last hope was to find an abandoned garage or a farm by the roadside. His life depended on it. Even better than he had hoped. Carl Faubert had succeeded once more and was now on his way to new adventures. Spread out on a few acres of untouched forest, bellowing caribou, everlasting snow, and undefiled lakes, the Manistan region was no tourist hub. It was said to have been populated for millennia by Cree people, and ever since the industrial era, by the metal mining industry. The truck was running on fumes. Good thing that the general store was close by. Surrender their divine nectar sweet. In all likelihood, they had to be switched on from inside the store. A milkman had to drive by every week to fill the bottle. The fresh milk indicated a recent visit. Something fell to the bottom of the box. Carl had no trouble recognizing his employer. He had been killed. There was no need to be a detective to figure that out. But only a detective could have noticed that the killer had to have been very close, that the fatal blow had been given before the victim even realized. An explosion suddenly occurred outside. The snowstorm pummeled everything in its path. Carl was not surprised when he heard no tone. Carl knew that Gilles Lachance was in charge of the general store. That made him one of Hamilton's employees. A very angry employee, as Carl could plainly see. The snowstorm pummeled everything in its path. Carl was not surprised when he heard no tone. According to that log, it seemed like the whole village owed some money to the general store. Carl was far more interested in the bunch of nearby addresses he had just gotten his hands on, though. The note explained that the garage and the store couldn't be supplied with electricity at the same time. A radiator without power is as good as a wood stove without logs. A milkman had to drive by every week to fill the bottles. The fresh milk indicated a recent visit. The murder weapon. What was that doing there, Carl wondered. Hamilton must have been determined to keep some information secret to post this key. Shame he got unlucky. Everything made sense now. Poor Hamilton's denunciation was interrupted, and he figured it would be best to lock everything up and send the key to his correspondent, who would receive the box later on. Clever, but not enough. That's what happens to ordinary people playing spy. The pumps wouldn't surrender their divine nectar so easily. In all likelihood, they had to be switched on from inside the store. Staring intently at the controls won't be enough to make that lift budge. The poor thing was out of power. Maintaining his composure, Carl recalled something from his military training. Wolves always stay away from populated areas. Wait, was it about bears? Hate was in the air. Seems like some villagers barely tolerated each other. Carl was used to strange phenomena, but a chunk of ice like this, as if an iceberg came out of the ground, that was a first. Prince? Carl found a surprise at every turn. Was the camera faulty, or was it a possible lead? The crowbar was stuck under the lift. Notwithstanding Carl's imposing stature, car lifting wasn't part of his skill set yet. At long last, the crowbar was within Carl's grasp. Surely it would come in handy at some point. Carl felt a chill down his spine and had a terrifying realization. If Hamilton was dead, then who was going to pay him? Carl knew straight away where to find the infuriated Gilles Lachance. Any good investigation would have to start there. Carl, ever diligent in his work, always carried his log on him, in which he scribbled down thoughts and leads alike during the course of his investigations. Carl was beginning to know the store and its surroundings like the back of his hand. The seeker had sought. Carl wondered what the hell could that thing be. It looked like a man fossilized in ice. All of a sudden, Carl felt like he was pulled inside a world of dreams. A cold, unknown dimension. Somehow, self-control was slipping from his grasp. To all appearances, this was a hunting log. Better yet, a war diary. What could these engraved numbers mean? A fresh path suddenly appeared before Carl. Carl had that feeling you get when you immerse your frozen hands in hot water. What happened? Now at least he knew who the unfortunate man petrified in ice was. Gilles Lachance, the general store's manager himself. The Polaroid, Carl's long-standing and faithful ally, had seen its share of husbands caught red-handed cheating. There's always something out there waiting to be snapped away. That had to be the worst parking job ever. Who was Carl to judge, though? It may be customary to park like that around these parts, or not. A milkman had to drive by every week to fill the bottles. The fresh milk indicated a recent visit. It was so cold. Already Carl did not feel his toes anymore. A wintry atmosphere surrounded the house. The soundlessness of the area suggested it was empty. The key, which seemed to be meant for a padlock, bore an inscription reading Cloutier et Fils. A company name. Better keep an eye open. Businesses weren't exactly numerous around these parts. The coals were still warm. Someone must have been stirring them up. Money in a jar. What a shame. Carl would have loved cookies. The spirograph amused Carl. It was a nice modern toy, aside from being repetitive by nature and completely useless. Still, it found its way into many Quebecois homes. The picture had been taken inside the house. It was the same wallpaper. Judging by the smiles, nobody suspected the impending misfortunes. Little Martin Blais with a family member. There was some resemblance between them, and Carl took note of the sense of bonding and pride they projected. A pay stub for some undoubtedly harsh lumberjack work. Alexandre Blais felled trees and chopped woods for Cloutier et Fils. The sheets were in such a way that indicated a rude awakening, followed by a hurried escape. What had happened here? A window left open in that weather? Perhaps something had to be watched. When finding a boot, one wonders what became of the foot. Carl's big fingers prevented him from reaching the key. There should be a law forbidding doctors from falling sick. In spite of Dr. Beaupre's goodwill, the place didn't look much like a physician's office. It could easily be mistaken for a sewing shop. For the one-eyed, or for other vision problems, the eye patch was the way to go. Carl got the trembles as he imagined the excruciating pain that kind of scalpel could no doubt inflict. Within these miserable walls, patients probably felt more like in a slaughterhouse than in a doctor's office. A chamber pot. Fortunately for Carl, inspecting it wouldn't further this particular investigation. Dr. Beaupre had done his medical studies quite far from here. He was surely one of the first students out of the new campus to settle on the mountainside. A communist manifesto. Only a few years ago, this type of allegiance meant prison time. And even at present, the Western world was very wary of the Soviet threat. Why would the doctor own such a book? There was no doubt that the doctor and Hamilton knew each other very well. The good doctor, flanked by his beautiful spouse. Pure happiness, captured on cardstock. Carl recognized this woman's soulful eyes. Was it Dr. Beaupre who had hit him head-on at the village border? Nobody kills a rich patient to start a revolution. It didn't make any sense. He had to dig deeper still to understand. Luckily, that was Carl Faubert's specialty. Doctors used light-reflecting frontal mirrors to look inside the patient's cavities. That was a bit unsettling. But back then, it was pretty much always the case with medicine. Someone had lost a few liters of blood here. Carl's first thought had been a lumber accident, someone's hand cut by a saw, or a hunting accident. In any case, whoever had lost all this blood couldn't have gone far. Perhaps they were already dead. Carl felt like he knew the doctor now. His belongings had spoken lengths about him. But what Carl had heard worried him.
mon bonhomme? Qu'est-ce que tu fais là, l'étrange? Je m'attendais pas à ce qu'un étrange retentisse par ici. Moi te dire, je prends plus de chance depuis que ça rôde dans ce bout-là. J'ai ma carabine au bout du doigt, et puis bang, 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 si ça s'approche. Si tu veux du linge chaud, parce que t'es habillé comme un gars de la ville, je dirais pas non à une bonne bouteille de caribou. Puis tu pigeras ce que tu voudras parmi mes guinées. Gomme-moi la belle rose de la tulipe, qui se donne au yob sur le mercredi des cendres. C'est-tu pas effrayant, cette histoire-là? Vois-tu le livre, là? C'est le Wendigo. Ouais, le Wendigo. Un guerrier qui devient un loup pour se venger de sa grosse peine. Ah, la belle pétarade. En 17 que c'était. Et le Kaiser, il se souvient de moi avec ma belle carabine. Bang, bang, que je lui disais. Bang, bang, bang. Ah, le bon temps. Mon beau bonnet du bon temps. Puis ma ceinture, où ce que je glissais mon fils. Le monde tournait avec le second quand on s'habillait tout de même. Reste encore beau. Tout ce qui est vieilli est bien meilleur. Oyez, 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 il y a un petit gars d'écarté dans ma maison. Hé, la Corriveau, Batèche, ça te passe l'envie de te marier, la Corriveau. Elle tuait tous ses maris, squick, les uns après les autres. Pas de pitié dans le mariage. Touche pas à ça, l'enfant, tu pourrais te faire mal. Touche pas à ça, l'enfant, tu pourrais te faire mal. Ben oui, une couche. Tu peux-tu tout faire en même temps, toi? Dans mon temps, c'était comme sur l'image. On était vrais, fiers, forts, puis on avait le bon lieu de notre bord. Gadon, ça ouvre l'appentis. Prends-la, je m'en fous. Perds ton temps dans mes déchets tant que tu rapportes du caribou. D'apparence que mon caribou tarde.
There, Carl had fed his mind, but had forgotten the harsh reality that his body also needed nourishment, especially in the dead of winter. An axe, not too shabby. Carl felt he needed to protect himself. place looked more like a pigsty than a house. A heavy stench of curdled milk, cheap alcohol, and boiled cauliflower filled the air. Back then, in Africa and elsewhere, people were ready to take up arms to stand against the yoke of English imperialism. In Montreal, mailboxes were blown up, abductions were carried out, and violent manifestos were distributed to media outlets. But around here, in the great northernmost, all a man could do is curse out loud against a faraway evil and pray for the revolution to arise. That man, by any reckoning, was from that very stock. Rock music invaded the minds of men even in the remotest of places. The man didn't own a turntable, though, so there's that going for him. You had to be out of your mind to cook up white whiskey at home. The all-surrounding stench of alcohol alone was probably enough to gas a man to death. Carl knew right away that the owner of this place wasn't a copper collector. No, this was a junkman's base of operations. The guy definitely seemed like quite the expert in scavenging scrap metal, with or without permission, surely. In the right hands, red metal could sell like hotcakes. Today, Jean Blouin. Seems like that pig had a name after all. With a homemade shooting range such as this, it wasn't hard to imagine a stray bullet ending its course inside the flesh of an unsuspecting passerby. Granted, Carl thought, there wasn't much in the way of passers-by around here. Carl felt that it was mission accomplished, with the wicked nectar in his hands. Garbage trucks rarely made a stop in the area. Thankfully, the lake served as a pretty good backup dump for those times when the bins started overflowing. Carl wondered how long he would have to endure this skin-stinging cold. The cold seemed to be more brutal here than anywhere else. It seeped into bones and into every breath to get to the heart until it stopped.
Tu m'amènes un bon galon de caribou, puis on devient amis. Sinon, mon petit gars, tu sors avant que je te sorte. Mon beau bonnet du beau temps. Puis ma ceinture, où ce que je glissais mon flasque. Le monde tournait plus rond quand on s'habillait tout de même.
An axe, not too shabby. Carl felt he needed to protect himself. There, Carl had fed his mind, but had forgotten the harsh reality that his body also needed nourishment, especially in the dead of winter. The place looked more like a pigsty than a house. A heavy stench of curdled milk, cheap alcohol, and boiled cauliflower filled the air. You had to be out of your mind to cook up white whiskey at home. The all-surrounding stench of alcohol alone was probably enough to gas a man to death. The rag reeked of fermented vomit. Carl wondered how one could bear to live in such gross and horrid conditions. Carl now knew how to quench the drunkard's thirst. Jean Blouin. Seems like that pig had a name after all. Rock music invaded the minds of men even in the remotest of places. The man didn't own a turntable, though, so there's that going for him. Carl felt that it was mission accomplished, with the wicked nectar in his hands.
Critique-toi, mon caribou, pour revenir de même. Ah, quand on cherche, on trouve. Parce que je t'aime bien, à cette heure, je vais te dire quelque chose. Tu fais bien de prendre ma pénice. Parce que par là-bas, tu vas rencontrer le vrai froid. Un froid qui glace comme t'en as jamais connu dans ta vie.
Cabin had been very generous to Carl. He couldn't have asked for more. Sometimes, and especially around here, people are so possessive with their land, as a dog is with hydrants. What good was a motorless car? The mechanic sure had an odd way to go about repairing things. Well, this truck's not going anywhere. Where were the amputated parts? Carl grinned as he pictured a Frankenstein-esque car lying around somewhere made of parts from a dozen different vehicles. Another worrisome victim of this ice, this one seemingly petrified in action. The poor man, before being frozen solid, seemed to have been defending the entrance to his cabin. But from what? Something very important must have been in there for the man to take such time and effort to hide it. But Carl didn't know how to reach it. The very first steps of man on the moon were made more than a year ago. The event had surely captivated the mechanic's mind for him to still keep this around. To all appearances, Carl concluded, the owner of the place had moved more essentials from his house inside the garage. Peculiar man indeed. The week of October 5th, thought Carl. That was this week. The plug should have been here by now. Perhaps someone was expecting an important call. In any case, that person's in for a long wait. Carl already noticed that telephone services weren't provided in this area. The milk was sorted by color, from the whitest to the greenest, or in other words, from the freshest to the sourest. Nice carillon. They say it's supposed to soothe the soul. But with this powerful gale that seemingly never sleeps, it was far more likely to get on anyone's nerves. These scribblings were undoubtedly the mark of a tormented mind. Something wasn't right in the poor mechanic's head. If some daring person could manage to get their hands on the missing parts, Carl was willing to bet that the craft would have taken flight. Weird stuff. Kind of a crossing between a colander and a hairdryer. What was it for? To play telepath? To protect against nuclear waves? Roswell, Atamipek, same story. Large deserts conducive to extravagant follies. Carl hadn't lived up to his good finder reputation. He still hadn't found any of the wealth contained in Lamotte's lands. By following the plan, Carl was led to believe that the snowmobile's parts had to be scattered about in the vicinity. Carl had no idea how to interpret a message like that. On the surface, it seemed like he had one half too many of this puzzle, enough to know he shouldn't take this testimony as gospel. The entire thing, being some punishment for a murder committed by Hamilton, seemed like an outlandish theory. Carl was doubtful. Carl still wasn't done with the mechanic's place. A fire can't be started with a snap of the fingers. That large antenna in the middle of the path, undoubtedly ideal in attempting to communicate with little green men, was quite awkwardly placed. There had to be a lever to control it, maybe behind it. Carl would have to figure out how to reach it. The electric terminals appeared to be linked together, but for what purpose? Carl rejoiced at the unexpected source of heat, but not as much as his freezing hands. Open sesame. So that's where the generator key was hiding. All that was left was to use it. At last, so big an effort for an oh so tiny piece of metal. Carl still wasn't done with the mechanic's place. It was an indisputable fact that machines like this entailed a level of intellectual finesse that Carl was lacking. Weird stuff. Kind of a crossing between a colander and a hairdryer. What was it for? To play telepath? To protect against nuclear waves? The man has a passion for intergalactic things. Back then, people were obviously scared of the Russian atomic bomb, but an invasion by extraterrestrials was a legit fear as well. Seems like the mechanic had made his choice. Nice carillon. They say it's supposed to soothe the soul. But with this powerful gale that seemingly never sleeps, it was far more likely to get on anyone's nerves. Carl, like many of his contemporaries, felt like he had more trouble breathing when he wasn't smoking. Cigarette was his own personal breathing assistant. Luckily, he had the coat to protect him from the biting cold. The cold seemed to be more brutal here than anywhere else. It seeped into bones and into every breath to get to the heart until it stopped. Carl needed to be dressed in warm clothes to survive. Another instance of this magic ice. What was this one doing, lying on the ground, so afraid? The plot thickened like water into ice. He had been running in fear from something creeping towards him, against which he couldn't do anything, only to end up like this, petrified and cold. It seemed as though Régin had been ready to take up arms and slay people like Hamilton. Could he have committed murder for his cause? Who could have gotten killed in front of his very eyes? Carl wondered how long he would have to endure this skin-stinging cold. Carl suddenly felt observed. He was worried about a presence around him. no stone can withstand the force of dynamite. The crossbow bolt stuck into the wooden stairs reminded Carl of the arrow that was said to have hit Achilles' heel. But who was the intended Achilles this time? The air was freezing, right down to the bone. cold turned into pain. Carl needed to find someplace warm. The otherworldly ice had struck again. The woman's hopes and dreams were frozen in eternity. Something was hidden under the stairs. The man grabbed his rifle. Carl felt a sense of dread in him. Perhaps their spousal relationship had been cooling down lately. It seemed like secrecy was commonplace in this house. The vision's veil was lifted, and he was back to reality. A reality in which Giselle, Gilles' loving spouse, was motionless, frozen in ice. That window had seemingly been left open for a while, Carl thought. Given the punishing weather, it couldn't have been intentional. Ah, moving. What a pleasant activity. Of course, you'll find the record player only to find the records weeks later in some random box. Carl had seen that kind of safe before. With its double-layered security system blending letters and numbers, its code couldn't be broken by the common burglar. The general store, along with several more infrastructures in the area, had been acquired by wealthy industrialist William J. Hamilton. Perhaps the village should be rechristened Hamiltown. What a mess! Clearly, there was some major revamping work underway here. The place looked barely habitable. Many boxes scattered about. Carl didn't need to summon his detective training to quickly figure that the Lachausses had just moved in. A nice white coating would restore the room to its charm of olden days. Beautiful portrait of Gilles and Giselle, bound together by the chains of conventional love. A nice white coating would restore the room to its charm of olden days. Many boxes scattered about. Carl didn't need to summon his detective training to quickly figure that the Lachausses had just moved in. What was even the point of locking your door if everyone hid their key in the same place? Carl was starting to feel like his investigator life lacked challenge. The house smelled like incense, the kind that reminds you of the good Lord, of peace. Religion was very influential throughout Quebec many years ago. Indeed, it was surprising that Carl did not come across a single chapel since arriving here. The perfect cookie-cutter Catholic family, most likely attending church every Sunday. Who knew that giraffes thrived in the North Pole? The craze for toys was stupefying. Love of religion and ancestors was rooted deep inside the hearts of Canadians of old, to which the Bedards appeared to be closely related. The empty cradle sent an eerie feeling down Carl's spine, as if minutes ago someone just grabbed the baby and made a run for it. Jean-Luc Bédard had without a doubt been the closest man in the village to William Hamilton, otherwise known as Uncle Willie. Carl wasn't desperate enough to invade a village woman's privacy. A true Catholic always strives to keep lowly temptations at bay. Obviously, Carl thought, someone in this house wasn't doing a good job at upholding the Holy Bible's teachings. It was a classic Canadian house, except for the absent horde of kids that would normally be swarming about. Just one more move and white is checkmated. Game over. It seems the game was abandoned right before the final strike came down. The photograph was snapped not too far from here, Carl noticed. The couple seemed to be very good friends. The couple radiated something akin to lightheartedness, to freedom. Perhaps some people out there truly found a way to live happily ever after. A picture of Wilfred in his youth. Carl figured right away that the man must have been some kind of wildlife officer. All manners of clothing were gone, as if the Rois drove out of town with their closet in tow. Not a single weapon was left. All of them were gone. The crossbow bolts had the same origin. Carl was sure of it. Who was it? And more importantly, what was being hunted like this? Without a single window to brighten things up, the inside of the cabin was almost pitch black. Beware of close encounters of knee and furniture. Welcome to Ali Baba's Cave, Lumberjack Edition. Surely Carl would find something worth his time in here. It was a typical shack, just like the ones you hear about in Quebecois legends. Local lumberjacks used it to rest and twice a day eat up their pea soup. The track was fresh. That meant the car sunk down just a little while ago. Now where the hell could the passengers possibly have gone? Carl was becoming increasingly convinced that this was not normal hunting. The game that was being tracked was fearsome, so much so that the hunter didn't dare approach it. What could it be? There was only void where the road should be. Carl hated dead ends. He felt trapped. It was as if the road had drowned in the lake. He would have to find help by another road. Carl knew why he was suddenly shivering. He was going back to the realm of visions. Carl had no issue recognizing the spirit-like figures, but he couldn't figure out what they wanted from him. The phantom, freed of reality's shackles, vanished in the forest. Earlier, Carl had witnessed a tragedy that befell it. Another phantom disappeared in the wilderness. Carl had seen what happened to it too. A third phantom gently faded away. Carl noticed that as the cursed villagers finally left reality, He could feel a sense of unburdening exuding from them in an almost intimate way. The last phantom, lost in solitude up until now, joined the others in the forest's darkness, free at last to enjoy an eternal, well-deserved slumber. Carl was only beginning to understand the horror which had struck his village. He understood that the dead were piling up and that he couldn't help them by himself. The road was clear for him. He needed to push further north and fast to find help. Another diary. Carl felt like someone was trying to communicate with him. Or was it simply the result of happenstance? Carl's scout training was buried deep in his memory. What do you need again to start a fire? Carl had found what he was looking for. He needed to get back on the road. Carl reckoned that the place was still inhabited less than 24 hours ago. His detective sensed tingled, revealing to him, or was it the strong smell of wilderness in the air, that there were most likely two men. seems like this place was long deserted. Just one more move for black to checkmate white. Right until that point, Carl had believed that the object of this crossbow hunting had been a ravenous wolf who was terrorizing the village. But as he noticed the height at which the bolts had been fired, he concluded that the beast had to have been as tall as a man on his feet, not unlike a gorilla. The thought was chilling. Carl wondered how long he would have to endure this skin-stinging cold. The cold was burning Carl. He would not hold up much longer. He had to warm himself. Two more victims of this ice plague. Carl felt a chill down his spine. What if he was next? Carl felt the strong pull of a vision overcome him. A young woman. It looked like a simple hunting accident. There was Hamilton. Carl recognized him. A major hunting accident. The doctor examined the young woman. But death couldn't be overturned. She was dead. It was not the type of body you buried in a big ceremony in the village graveyard. It had to be hidden. No one could know about this. The best way to do that was to have a simple-minded man bury the poor girl. Lamotte, the mechanic. The doctor denied the unfair death of the young woman, but Hamilton had him in his grips. Hamilton knew all of the poet's secrets and wouldn't hesitate to reveal them. I know all about your crimes, you little communist. You know mine. What a sordid affair. Carl understood the ins and outs of the affair. A woman had been killed in an unfair accident, and a young warrior had damned himself to avenge her. But Hamilton, the one responsible, had already been killed, and so the beast could not quench its thirst for vengeance. And now, recklessly, Carl had pulled the bolt from the beast's heart. A beast who was but a young free man lost without his fiancée, and who had, out of hatred, become Wendigo. The narrow passage sheltered him, but for how long? The narrow passage sheltered him, but for how long? When you disappeared, so did purity. I would defend purity against the winds, the tides, against ice and blizzard. Could it be that all this was but a story of justice and vengeance? The soulful doctor, avenging his fiancée's unjust death by avenging this young woman as though she was his lover. Are these passionate feelings not precisely the kind of feelings that could cause a storm, petrify people deep inside, create monsters?
Un survivant! On a trouvé un survivant!